James was having a tiring day. Life as a clown was exhausting enough, but now he was in trouble with his son's primary school. It seemed that, when asked, "What did you do on the weekend?" his son had answered, "My dad dressed up as a woman and took me to a tent." The repercussions of which are not something a busy man wishes to deal with. This, thought Catherine, was a perfect example of her sibling relationship. Granted, Ellie had more experience rowing, but surely that should mean she should let me steer and do the harder work herself. Mother, of course, took no notice. Everyone knew Ellie was her favourite anyway. It wasn't that Daniel was complaining, but he had hoped that, after going to all the trouble of taking his nephew to the lakes, he'd get more excited about the lakes than the sheep. He didn't want to sound ungrateful, but, in all fairness, there were sheep much closer to home. "You're not fooling me," thought Susan to herself. "That's not real velvet." It was well known the whole ceremony was a sham, but she had hoped that they'd pay attention to their fabrics. It wasn't even that good a fake. It didn't have that characteristic sheen of the genuine article. Certainly now, standing amongst the wreckage, Charlie had next to no appreciation for the cause and effect series of events which had led to the accidental destruction of his aunt's house, or that, at least in legal terms, he was now technically guilty of insurance fraud. Undeniably, this was the time that Jack, Big J to his friends, had always dreamt of. Now he was here, though. His golden years had dulled to a yellow ochre, and he couldn't really hold back the semi-existential dread, the fear that retirement wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. Bernard was back to confront his childhood fear, the sleek silver mechanical swan that stood, pride and joy, slap bang in the middle of the Bowes Museum. He knew now, of course, that it didn't really feed on metal fish, but he still couldn't shake the idea of all those mechanical lives that had been lost to its daily activation. Rebecca knew that organic farming was the way forward. She knew it was better for both her produce and her business, but every now and then, usually after a particularly long day, she thought about all the various pests she spent her life fighting, and felt like spraying poison on the bastards. Little did they know, but that particular blue car was going to become a key component in one of the largest British bank heists of the decade. In their defence, the car was equally clueless. Beneath the smiles and laughter, there was an atmosphere of hostility, which had practically become a given at this sort of garden party. What had started as a harmless tradition had quickly become competitive, and now it wasn't out of the ordinary for the village to have 3 or 4 such parties within a single month. It wasn't that Milo was scared of cows. In fact, he felt a certain quadrupedal affinity towards them. But he couldn't help but feel he appreciated their company much more from the other side of the field. As his mother always said, cows are curious and stupid, but you don't want to get on one's wrong side. Gerard always came up here when he needed a think. The fresh air cleared his head, and the walk woke him up. Besides, it was a way of escaping the kids for a moment, and getting some peace and quiet. At trying times such as these, he appreciated the headspace. Despite all the bitterness, Nathaniel felt almost heroic at that moment. If asked, of course, he would be firmly of the opinion that if Alexander couldn't walk home himself, he shouldn't have come out to play in the first place. Inwardly, however, he felt as though he was the noble, self-sacrificing, platonic ideal of an elder brother. Nobody really knew why Mr. Methuselah drove that car. When people asked, he always managed to dodge the question somehow. "Oh, it keeps the rain out," he might say, or "it's faster than walking." Mrs. Methuselah would always tut and shake her head. "It's better not to ask," she warned. "You wouldn't thank me if I told you." The town was beautiful. Robert couldn't deny that. But something about the place seemed off. The locals were almost too nice, the sun too warming. Something was horribly wrong, and Robert was determined to get to the bottom of it. This was a day Nathan just knew he'd never forget. He could picture himself as an old man, fondly reminiscing about his first kiss, his wedding day, his retirement, and the day he managed to skip a stone 7 whole times. Undoubtedly, he seemed innocent enough then, but 17 years on, Obadiah would become one of the fiercest cattle rustlers Northumberland had ever known. Not counting the Border Reivers, of course. They were pretty bad. Such was Shrove Tuesday tradition. Pop would wheel out the old stove and set to work, rain or shine. The first pancake would always burn, so the tradition went, and the second had to be given to the cat. But for the rest of the day, pancakes would be as plentiful as blackberries. A lot had changed since then, but if Bethany's facts were correct, this was the same staircase her great-grandmother had fallen down and died on nearly 40 years ago. The more she stood there, the more Bethany couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been an accident. What had been intended as an immersive birthday gift had become for Derek a voyage of self-discovery. For one thing, he'd found out how easily he gets seasick. As theologically sound as his preaching was, the vicar at St. Bartholomew's Parish Church had one quite unusual habit. Whenever the occasion prompted him to say Beelzebub, he would cough slightly and murmur the word in a soft tone. Local conjecture had it that either he thought the name too evil to say properly, or he didn't know how it was pronounced. Edith's passing had been a blow to the entire Armstrong family, and after the arrangements and will reading and funeral were past, they thought it fitting to pay for a tree to be planted in the corner of the park she so often visited. On the day that it was due to be planted, however, what did they find but a sapling, clearly planted the day before? There was no mention of it in the council records, and nobody remembered seeing it being planted. The Armstrongs decided it was best to simply purchase a plaque and claim the tree as their own. The parish pilgrimage, namely, a walk between the 3 local churches, was always competitive between the children. There were a couple of stretches where tired children could get a lift in a car for part of the journey, letting them rest for a moment. This, though, was in the eyes of the elder children nothing short of cheating. It was better to die on your feet than to show such cowardice. Back at the school hall, the children enjoyed a little afternoon tea. Those who had taken lifts were resented by the rest. They hadn't really deserved it. Dennis and Eileen Porter would every summer, without fail, make the trip down to Dennis's grandparents in Liverpool. It had become a little tradition to stop for lunch in the Lake District. They found a lovely little picnic spot, and, to Dennis, the only thing stopping it from being perfect was his wife's recent fixation with Ryvita. Nobody was complaining, of course, but many people were curious about Wilbur's new peculiar habit of throwing surprise parties. Only last week, Stanley was treated to a cheese and wine party. As it happened, he was partial to a little cheese and wine, but he didn't see how Wilbur could know that. The whole thing had been booked in a hurry. Anne had just finished reading Swallows and Amazons and wanted to celebrate. Granted, she didn't really know how to sail, but she was determined not to let that stop her. William kept smiling, but the party was not going to plan. For starters, they'd served the wine chilled. But what he was mostly concerned about was Harriet's honestly really fun game, which for some reason needed all the women on one side of the table and all the men on the other. So the table was set for the nightly game of whist. Arthur was confident. He had been practicing his sleight of hand and had learned a little trick to push the better cards in his direction.